Imagine waking up one morning. The greatest kingdoms on earth still stand. Massive palaces glitter with gold. Merchant ships cross the Mediterranean carrying priceless bronze, ivory, and luxury goods. Kings exchange gifts worth entire fortunes. The world has never seemed stronger. Then, within a single generation, cities begin to burn. Empires disappear. Trade routes vanish. Entire civilizations are erased from history. No one knows exactly why. Some blamed mysterious invaders arriving from the sea. Others believed the gods had abandoned humanity. Still others think the real enemy was something far more terrifying. A chain reaction so devastating that once it started, no kingdom, not even mighty Egypt, could stop it. This wasn't just the collapse of one empire. It was the end of an entire world. This is the story of the Sea Peoples, and the greatest civilization collapse in human history. To understand how everything collapsed, we first need to understand just how powerful this world truly was. Travel back with me to around 1250 BC. The Mediterranean wasn't a collection of isolated kingdoms. It was a vast international network. A Bronze Age version of globalization. Every major civilization depended on every other civilization. Copper arrived from Cyprus. Tin came from distant Afghanistan and Central Asia. Gold flowed from Egypt. Luxury goods traveled from Mesopotamia. Glass was manufactured in elite workshops. Wine crossed oceans. Olive oil was traded by the thousands of jars. Even ideas, languages, religions, and military technology spread across this enormous network. No kingdom was truly alone. They were all connected. And that connection made them incredibly wealthy. But it also made them dangerously fragile. Because when one kingdom suffered, the effects spread like falling dominoes. Long before anyone realized it, the seeds of disaster had already been planted. If you lived during this age, there was one nation everyone respected: Egypt. Ruled by the mighty pharaoh Ramesses II and later his successors. Egypt controlled enormous wealth. Its fertile Nile River produced food unlike anywhere else. While neighboring kingdoms feared famine, Egypt harvested grain year after year. Gigantic temples rose from the desert. Obelisks reached toward the sky. Massive statues reminded everyone that Pharaoh ruled by divine power. Foreign kings desperately sought Egypt's friendship. Some even begged Pharaoh for military protection. Others sent daughters to marry into the royal family. Gold from Nubia filled Egyptian treasuries. Skilled artisans crafted jewelry that still amazes archaeologists today. The Egyptian army was feared across the Near East. Its chariots dominated battlefields. Its archers were legendary. To the outside world, Egypt looked unstoppable. But appearances can be deceiving. Underscore 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 underscore. North of Egypt stood another giant, the Hittite Empire. Centered in modern-day Turkey, the Hittites controlled one of the largest armies on earth. Their capital, Hattusa, was protected by enormous stone walls. Its gates were guarded by gigantic carved lions. Thousands of government officials managed one of history's earliest bureaucracies. The Hittites possessed something every kingdom desperately needed: iron-working knowledge. Although bronze still dominated weapons, the Hittites had begun experimenting with iron technology. Their kings negotiated treaties with Egypt. Sometimes they fought. Sometimes they became allies. Their rivalry shaped the ancient world. No one imagined that within a few decades, the Hittite Empire would disappear so completely. that later generations wouldn't even remember it had existed. Across the Aegean Sea, another civilization flourished. The Mycenaeans. These were the people who inspired many of the legends later told by Homer. Massive fortress palaces crowned rocky hills. Warrior kings ruled from heavily fortified cities. Mycenaean ships crossed the Mediterranean carrying luxury goods. Their craftsmen created extraordinary gold masks, beautiful weapons, and elegant pottery. Their warriors fought with long spears, tower shields, and horse-drawn chariots. To outsiders, they appeared wealthy, powerful, and secure. Yet beneath the surface, political rivalries simmered. Resources became harder to obtain. Trade became increasingly important. Without international commerce, their entire economy would struggle. Like every other civilization, they had become dependent on a system no one controlled. Far to the east, on the coast of modern Syria, lay one of the richest trading cities in history, Ugarit. Unlike Egypt or the Hittites, its greatest weapon wasn't military strength. It was commerce. Ships arrived daily, carrying copper, tin, ivory, glass, wine, textiles, and luxury goods from every corner of the known world. Merchants spoke multiple languages. Diplomats exchanged letters with kings hundreds of miles away. Palaces overflowed with imported treasures. The city's scribes carefully recorded every shipment, every tax, every treaty. Ironically, those records would survive long enough to tell us exactly how terrifying the final days became. Because just before Ugarit vanished forever, its king sent a desperate message asking for help. The reply never came. Today, when one country experiences an economic crisis, the effects spread around the globe. Stock markets fall. Factories close. Supply chains break. In many ways, the Bronze Age worked the same way. Bronze required two metals, copper and tin. Neither was available everywhere. If trade stopped, bronze production stopped. If bronze production stopped, weapons couldn't be made. Farm tools became scarce. Armies weakened. Economies collapsed. Everything depended on ships continuing to sail, merchants continuing to trade, kings continuing to cooperate. It was an astonishing achievement, but also an incredibly dangerous system. One major disruption could trigger a disaster unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. And that disruption was coming. Looking back, archaeologists have discovered something unsettling. Years before cities burned, there were warning signs. Some regions experienced drought. Harvests declined. Letters between kings became increasingly desperate. Several rulers begged neighboring kingdoms for grain. Others requested military assistance. Some complained about pirates attacking shipping lanes. At first, these incidents seemed unrelated. A failed harvest here, a raid there, a delayed shipment somewhere else. No one realized these were merely the opening moves of one of history's greatest catastrophes. Because somewhere beyond the horizon, a mysterious force was already moving. A force history would later remember by a terrifying name: the Sea Peoples. And when they finally arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. For centuries, the great kingdoms of the Bronze Age believed their enemies were predictable. If war came, it came from neighboring kingdoms. If famine struck, grain could be purchased from an ally. If pirates appeared, a navy could hunt them down. The world felt stable, even when conflicts broke out. But around the late 13th century BC, something began to change. At first, no one knew exactly what they were facing. Reports arrived from distant coastlines. Merchant ships failed to return. Small ports went silent. Entire villages disappeared overnight. Survivors spoke of strange warriors arriving from the sea. They came in ships unlike the local fleets. They carried unfamiliar weapons. Some wore feathered headdresses. Others had horned helmets or round shields. What frightened witnesses most wasn't just that these warriors attacked. It was that they didn't come only as soldiers. They came with families. Women. Children. Ox carts loaded with belongings. It looked less like an invasion, and more like an entire civilization searching for a new home. No kingdom understood what this meant. Today we call them the Sea Peoples. But that's not what they called themselves. In fact, we still don't know what they called themselves. The name comes from Egyptian inscriptions carved into temple walls thousands of years ago. Egyptian scribes described groups with names such as the Shurden, Shikalesh, Peleset, Jeker, Denyen, and Weshish. Were they allies? Separate tribes? A loose coalition? No one can say with certainty. What is clear is that these groups appeared across the eastern Mediterranean within a remarkably short period of time. And wherever they appeared, destruction often followed. This is one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. For more than a century, historians have debated the origins of the Sea Peoples. One theory points toward the Aegean world. Perhaps they came from islands in the eastern Mediterranean. Another suggests western Anatolia, where political unrest may have forced communities to flee. Some researchers believe they were displaced by famine, drought, or internal conflict. Others argue they weren't one people at all. Instead, they may have been many different groups brought together by the same crisis. Imagine millions of people today suddenly losing access to food, trade, and security. Many would migrate. Some would settle peacefully. Others, desperate to survive, might fight for resources. The Late Bronze Age may have witnessed something similar. If that's true, then the Sea Peoples weren't simply conquerors. They may also have been refugees. As these mysterious groups moved across the region, cities along the coast began to disappear. Some were abandoned. Others were destroyed by fire. Archaeologists have uncovered layers of ash, collapsed walls, and shattered pottery dating to this turbulent period. In several locations, rebuilding never came. For generations, these once thriving centers remained silent. To the people living through it, the attacks must have felt unstoppable. No one knew where the next strike would happen. Trade ships became targets. Coastal settlements strengthened their defenses. Kings demanded more soldiers. Yet fear continued to spread. One empire stood directly in the path of the growing crisis: the Hittite Empire. For centuries, it had been one of the dominant powers of the Near East. Its armies had defeated rivals. Its diplomats had signed treaties with Egypt. Its capital, Hattusa, symbolized strength and stability. But empires rarely collapse overnight. The first signs were subtle. Harvests became less reliable. Political tensions increased. Neighboring regions grew restless. Maintaining a vast empire became more expensive. Then came external pressure. Enemies attacked from multiple directions. Trade networks weakened. Essential supplies became harder to obtain. Eventually, the system could no longer hold. Hattusa was abandoned and destroyed. The imperial administration disappeared. Within a surprisingly short time, one of the world's greatest kingdoms ceased to exist. For later generations, it was almost as if the Hittites had vanished from history. Among the most haunting discoveries from this era are clay tablets recovered from the ancient city of Ugarit. These tablets preserve messages written during the kingdom's final days. One letter speaks of enemy ships appearing along the coast. Another urgently requests military assistance. The tone is unmistakable. The writers knew they were in grave danger. Help was desperately needed. But their allies were facing crises of their own. Whether aid was delayed, defeated, or never sent, Ugarit stood largely alone. Soon afterward, the city was destroyed. Its palaces burned. Its harbor fell silent. Ironically, the intense fires that consumed the city helped preserve many of these clay tablets, allowing archaeologists thousands of years later to glimpse the fear and uncertainty of those final moments. As modern researchers piece together evidence from Egypt, Anatolia, Greece, Cyprus, and the Levant, one conclusion became increasingly clear. No single battle explains the Bronze Age collapse. No lone invader caused every city to fall. Instead, multiple crises appear to have unfolded at nearly the same time. Conflict, migration, economic disruption, political instability, environmental stress. Each problem made the others worse. A failed harvest strained governments. Weakened governments struggled to defend trade routes. Broken trade networks limited access to essential materials. Military power declined. Local rebellions became harder to contain. Communities already under pressure became vulnerable to outside attacks. The result was a chain reaction that spread across the eastern Mediterranean. For a time, Egypt remained standing. Protected by the Nile and its experienced military, it weathered the early stages of the crisis better than many of its neighbors. But Egyptian leaders were paying close attention. Reports from abroad described destroyed kingdoms. Former allies stopped sending messages. Trade missions failed to arrive. The world beyond Egypt's borders was changing rapidly. Pharaoh's officials understood that if these mysterious newcomers had defeated other powerful states, eventually, they would come for Egypt as well. And according to Egyptian inscriptions, that day was approaching. By the beginning of the 12th century BC, the world had changed beyond recognition. The Hittite Empire was gone. Many Mycenaean palaces lay in ruins. Important trading cities had been abandoned or destroyed. Across the eastern Mediterranean, old alliances had collapsed. For generations, kings had relied on diplomacy, trade, and powerful armies to maintain order. Now, those systems were failing. Yet one great power still stood: Egypt. To many people across the ancient world, Egypt represented the last island of stability in a sea of chaos. Its temples still functioned. Its fields still produced grain. Its government still collected taxes. Its army still answered to the pharaoh. But beneath that appearance of strength, the Egyptian leadership understood something terrifying. If every neighboring kingdom had fallen, how long before Egypt faced the same fate? The man who would face this challenge was Pharaoh Ramesses III. He ruled during one of the most dangerous periods in Egyptian history. Unlike the famous Ramesses II, whose reign was remembered for monumental construction and international prestige, Ramesses III inherited a kingdom surrounded by uncertainty. Messages arriving from foreign lands painted a grim picture. Former allies had disappeared. Trade had slowed. Powerful kingdoms that had existed for centuries no longer answered Egyptian diplomats. The world Egypt had known was vanishing. Ramesses III realized that traditional warfare would not be enough. He wasn't preparing to fight a neighboring king. He was preparing to defend an entire civilization. Egyptian records describe an approaching coalition unlike any enemy encountered before. Groups from different regions appeared to be moving together. Some traveled by sea. Others advanced over land. Entire families accompanied them. Ox-drawn carts carried possessions. Children walked beside armed warriors. This wasn't simply an army marching toward conquest. It looked like populations on the move. Whether driven by hunger, war, environmental disaster, or a combination of many pressures, these migrating groups were searching for new places to settle. Unfortunately for Egypt, the fertile Nile Delta looked like the perfect destination. Ramesses III understood that allowing enemy fleets to move freely into the Nile would be catastrophic. Instead of waiting behind city walls, he chose a different strategy. He prepared an ambush. Archers were stationed along the riverbanks. Warships waited in hidden positions. Soldiers reinforced strategic locations throughout the delta. If the sea peoples entered Egyptian waters, they would sail directly into a carefully planned trap. It was a risky decision. Failure could mean the destruction of Egypt itself. The Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu provide one of the most detailed visual records of this dramatic conflict. They show crowded ships crashing together, archers firing volleys of arrows, warriors falling into the water, hand-to-hand fighting aboard unstable vessels. According to the inscriptions, Egyptian forces attacked from both land and water. As enemy ships entered narrow channels, they lost the freedom to maneuver. Egyptian archers unleashed continuous volleys from protected positions. Once confusion spread among the attackers, Egyptian ships closed in. Grappling hooks pulled enemy vessels closer. Soldiers boarded them. Fierce combat followed. Whether every detail on the temple walls is historically exact remains debated. Ancient rulers often celebrated victories in ways that emphasized their own achievements. Even so, most historians agree that Egypt successfully repelled at least one major assault during this period. It was one of the defining moments of Ramesses III's reign. The battle was won. Egypt survived. But survival did not mean everything returned to normal. The international world that had made Egypt wealthy had largely disappeared. Trade became less reliable. Foreign allies were gone. Luxury goods became scarcer. The great network connecting civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean had been shattered. Even victorious kingdoms paid a heavy price. Egypt remained standing. But it emerged into a completely different world. Imagine visiting a bustling port that had welcomed ships from every corner of the Mediterranean. Now imagine returning years later. The docks stand empty. Warehouses are abandoned. Markets no longer echo with dozens of languages. The merchants are gone. The sailors have disappeared. The sea itself feels strangely quiet. This scene likely played out across numerous coastal cities after the collapse. Without regular trade, entire industries failed. Craftsmen lost access to raw materials. Kings collected fewer taxes. Governments weakened further. The economic engine that had powered the Bronze Age slowly ground to a halt. Historians sometimes describe this period as the transition from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age. But for the people living through it, it wasn't a chapter in a history book. It was the end of the world they knew. Generations of accumulated knowledge disappeared. Palaces that had stood for centuries became ruins. Writing systems fell out of use in several regions. Long-distance diplomacy nearly vanished. Communities became smaller and more isolated. The interconnected world of the Bronze Age gave way to a far more fragmented landscape. It would take centuries before many areas recovered. Were the Sea Peoples solely responsible for this transformation? Probably not. Could they have accelerated a crisis already unfolding? Many researchers believe so. History rarely has a single cause. Complex societies often fail when several problems strike at once. Environmental stress, political instability, economic disruption, migration, conflict. Each can weaken a civilization. Together, they can reshape the course of history. And that may be exactly what happened around 1200 BC. For more than 100 years, people searched for a simple answer. One enemy. One battle. One disaster. One moment that ended the Bronze Age. But history almost never works that way. The deeper archaeologists dug, the more complicated the mystery became. Every excavation, every ancient letter, every burned city, every layer of ash, added another piece to the puzzle. And slowly, a shocking realization began to emerge. The Sea Peoples may have been the final blow, but the Bronze Age world was already breaking apart from within. The collapse wasn't caused by one catastrophe. It was caused by many, happening almost all at once. Imagine living in a kingdom where your entire economy depends on successful harvests. Then imagine the rains stop coming. Year after year. Fields begin to dry. Rivers shrink. Livestock die. Food prices soar. Families abandon farms. Hunger spreads across the countryside. This isn't imagination. Scientific studies of ancient pollen, lake sediments, and climate records suggest that parts of the eastern Mediterranean experience prolonged drought around the time of the collapse. A few bad harvests might be manageable, but a decade of poor harvests, that could destroy entire kingdoms. Food shortages don't just create hunger. They create fear, riots, migration, political instability. When people cannot feed their families, everything else begins to collapse. Now imagine you're a king. Your people are starving. Your soldiers need food. Your horses need grain. Your cities demand supplies. But every neighboring kingdom is facing the same crisis. Who can help? Trade partners stop exporting grain. Merchants avoid dangerous routes. Prices rise beyond what ordinary people can afford. Soon, people begin leaving their homes in search of better land. Some migrate peacefully. Others fight for survival. Entire populations begin moving across the Mediterranean. Suddenly, the mysterious migrations described in Egyptian records become much easier to understand. Another theory points beneath our feet. The eastern Mediterranean sits near several major tectonic fault lines. Even today, the region experiences powerful earthquakes. Some geologists believe that a series of large earthquakes may have struck multiple cities over several decades. Not one earthquake, but many. Imagine rebuilding your city after one devastating quake, only to be hit again a few years later. Walls collapse. Palaces crumble. Granaries are destroyed. Temples fall. Each reconstruction drains more resources. Eventually, governments simply run out of money. Archaeologists have found evidence of earthquake damage at several Bronze Age sites. But earthquakes alone cannot explain every destroyed city. They are likely one part of a much larger story. The Bronze Age economy depended on something surprisingly fragile. International trade. Remember bronze. Without copper, no bronze. Without tin, no bronze. Without ships, neither metal arrives. The moment maritime trade breaks down, weapons become harder to produce. Farm tools become scarce. Construction slows. Military strength declines. Merchants lose income. Governments collect fewer taxes. One broken trade route becomes 10. 10 become 50. Eventually, the entire system stops functioning. It was the ancient version of a global supply chain collapse. And once it began, every kingdom felt the consequences. History often focuses on invading armies. But some civilizations don't fall because enemies break through the gates. They fall because the people inside stop believing in the system. Heavy taxes, food shortages, political corruption, weak leadership, local governors competing for power. These pressures can slowly tear a kingdom apart. Archaeologists have found signs that some cities may have experienced internal unrest before they were destroyed. In some places, the greatest threat may not have come from outside the walls. It may have come from within. Military technology was changing. 4 centuries. Elite chariot warriors dominated battlefields. Maintaining chariots required wealth. Specialized craftsmen. Well-trained horses. Large amounts of bronze. Only powerful kingdoms could afford them. But new forms of warfare began to emerge. Large groups of infantry armed with spears, swords, and shields became increasingly effective. A kingdom that invested everything in expensive chariot armies suddenly faced opponents using different tactics. Military traditions that had worked for generations became less reliable. The balance of power was shifting. Now imagine all these crises happening together. A long drought reduces harvests. Food shortages trigger migration. Trade routes become unsafe. Bronze supplies disappear. Governments lose revenue. Rebellions spread. Earthquakes damage major cities. Then, armed groups arrive from the sea. Any one of these disasters would challenge a civilization. Combined, they become overwhelming. This is why many historians describe the Bronze Age collapse as the result of a perfect storm. Not one cause. Many causes. Each making the next crisis even worse. Like dominoes falling across an entire continent. The Bronze Age collapse is more than an ancient mystery. It offers a warning. Highly connected civilizations are incredibly successful. But they can also become vulnerable. When food systems fail, trade stops, governments weaken, public trust disappears. Small problems can grow into enormous crises. Modern societies are very different from those of 1200 BC. Yet we also depend on global trade, international cooperation, complex supply chains, and stable political institutions. The ancient world reminds us that strength alone is not enough. Resilience matters just as much. Even after decades of archaeological discoveries, one question remains unanswered. Who exactly were the Sea Peoples? Were they refugees? Invaders? Mercenaries? Former allies? Or simply survivors of a collapsing world? Perhaps the answer is all of the above. History rarely offers perfect villains or perfect heroes. Sometimes, entire civilizations become trapped inside forces larger than any one nation can control. And when that happens, even the greatest empires can disappear. History often remembers the moment civilizations fall. The burning cities. The final battles. The desperate last letters. But what happened after the flames died? What became of the millions of ordinary people who survived one of history's greatest disasters? For them, life didn't simply end. It changed. Forever. The world they had inherited from their parents was gone. The mighty kingdoms that once controlled trade, diplomacy, and warfare had disappeared. The familiar order of the Bronze Age had collapsed. Now, every family had to adapt to a new reality. Imagine walking through a city that had once been alive with thousands of people. Markets filled with merchants. Blacksmiths hammering bronze. Priests chanting in towering temples. Children running through crowded streets. Now imagine returning years later. The markets are empty. The workshops abandoned. The palace roof has collapsed. Wild grass grows between broken stones. Wind whistles through doorways that no one has crossed for generations. This wasn't the fate of just one city. It happened across much of the eastern Mediterranean. Many urban centers never regained their former importance. Some vanished so completely that later civilizations forgot they had ever existed. Among the hardest hit regions was Mycenaean Greece. The great palace complexes that had dominated the landscape disappeared. The administrative systems collapsed. Writing, which had been used to record taxes, trade, and government affairs, largely vanished from daily life. 4 centuries. There are far fewer written records. Historians call this period the Greek Dark Age. The word dark doesn't mean people stopped living or creating. It means we know much less about them because so few written sources survived. Communities became smaller, local, independent, instead of vast kingdoms. Many people lived in villages led by local chiefs. It would take centuries before Greece once again produced large cities and powerful states. One of the greatest changes following the collapse involved a metal. For generations, bronze had ruled the ancient world. But bronze depended on long-distance trade. Copper from one region, tin from another. If either supply failed, bronze production stopped. Iron was different. Although early iron tools were often less refined than bronze, iron ore existed in many more places. Communities no longer needed massive international trade networks just to produce basic weapons and tools. Slowly, very slowly, iron replaced bronze. This transition did not happen overnight. It took generations. But eventually, the Iron Age began. A new chapter in human history had opened. This remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. After their conflicts with Egypt, the Sea People seemed to disappear from historical records as a single coalition. Some groups likely settled along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Many scholars believe the Peleset, mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions, may be connected to the people later known as the Philistines. Archaeological discoveries reveal cultural changes in parts of the southern Levant around this time, including new styles of pottery and settlement. However, the evidence is still debated. History does not give us a clear ending. There was no final battle. No official surrender. No document explaining where every group went. Instead, the Sea Peoples fade into the background of history. Perhaps they stopped thinking of themselves as outsiders. Perhaps they became part of the very civilizations they once challenged. When we speak about the Bronze Age collapse, it's easy to focus on kings, pharaohs, generals, empires. But history belongs to ordinary people too. Think about the farmer whose fields no longer produced enough grain. The sailor whose trade routes vanished. The merchant whose business collapsed. The blacksmith who could no longer obtain bronze. The child who grew up never knowing the prosperous world their grandparents described. These people didn't choose to live through history. History happened to them. And like people in every age, they adapted. They rebuilt. They found new ways to survive. Recovery did not happen in a single generation. In some places, it took centuries. New kingdoms slowly emerged. Trade routes reopened. Technology improved. Writing returned. Cities expanded once again. Eventually, powerful civilizations such as the Assyrians, Phoenicians, and later the classical Greeks would shape the ancient world. But none of them rebuilt the Bronze Age exactly as it had been. That world was gone forever. The collapse marked not just an ending, but a transformation. Why does this story still matter? Because the Bronze Age collapse teaches a timeless lesson. No civilization is invincible. Not because people lack courage. Not because leaders lack intelligence. But because complex societies depend on countless invisible connections. Food, trade, communication, trust, security. When enough of those connections break at the same time, even the strongest empires can struggle. The people of the Bronze Age believed their world would last forever. History proved otherwise. More than 3,000 years later, archaeologists continue to uncover new clues. Every excavation has the potential to change our understanding. A buried city. A forgotten inscription. A shipwreck resting beneath the sea. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. Perhaps one day, we'll know exactly where the Sea Peoples came from. Perhaps we'll understand why so many civilizations collapsed almost simultaneously. Or perhaps, some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved. And maybe that's what makes this story so unforgettable. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the Mediterranean around 1200 BC. Hundreds of ships crossing blue waters. Bustling ports. Magnificent palaces. Powerful kings. A world connected by trade, diplomacy, and shared ambition. Now, watch it all disappear. Not in a single day. Not because of one battle. But through years of pressure. Conflict. Migration. Climate stress. Economic breakdown. And human resilience tested beyond its limits. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that history is never just about the past. It is about people. Choices. Challenges. And the fragile systems that hold civilizations together. Empires rise. Empires fall. But humanity endures. And somewhere beneath the ruins of ancient cities, the echoes of that lost world still wait for us to listen. Thank you for watching.